It's the space between the beats that determine the rhythm. It's the space between the notes that determine the harmony. Our attention is naturally drawn to things that occupy space. When you look up at the night sky, our attention is drawn more by stars and planets than the darkness between them. But sometimes that space is more interesting than the object itself. Silence can't speak louder than words. Milling the wood for this build, I thought a lot about the similarities between empty space that this wenge represents and a solid block of matter. Emptiness, just like these blocks of wood, has 3 dimensions of direction and 1 of time, and each contains within it an infinite number of shapes and sequences of events that can unfold. Each also has its own physics that govern its behavior. In honor of the telescope that inspired this build, I wanted to make sure that this was the most precise and accurate instrument that I ever made. And so I did take time to make really good templates. I also wanted to include a lot of subtle details that would likely go unnoticed. One of them is the pinstripe of Purple Heart down the shaft of the neck. Normally, I would simply split the blank down the entire length and then glue in the pinstripes. But in this case, I didn't want the Purple Heart to be seen at the headstock from any angle. One of the things I've never liked about laminated necks is how you can always see the laminations at the headstock. And in order to deal with this, a lot of builders just simply put a veneer over the headstock itself so you can't see it. But you can still see it at the tip of the headstock itself. So I wanted to avoid doing that. Getting these 2 pieces of wood flat enough to mate perfectly was a little bit tricky, but not as difficult as I expected. And here you can see what I'm talking about. The pinstripe ends right at the void, so there's no way it goes all the way through to the entire headstock. I wanted these pinstripes to be really thin and subtle, so I ended up using 2 pieces of veneer, and I was finally ready to glue up. The body will also have a stripe of Purple Heart, so here I am getting them glued up and ready to go. Normally I would inlay this type of detail, but I'm going for a particular effect, especially at the neck joint, so I have to build this guitar in layers. This will make sense when it's all said and done. Off camera, I did the same for the ash top. After the glue dried on the neck, I resurfaced it. And here you can see the look I was going for. A nice thin pinstripe of Purple Heart right down the center. So with all the blanks ready, I started to carve the back of the guitar. This has become a thing on my guitars, where the carve is on the back wood as opposed to the top. It leads to a subtle effect, but I think it's worth the effort. Just as space is the backbone of night, this is the backbone of our guitar. Another commonality between guitars and empty space is that while their physics might be classical, their math is geometry. On January 26 of 1949, Edwin Hubble made his first observations with the Hale telescope. Hubble had already discovered on Mount Palomar the existence of galaxies outside of our own. But Hubble's most interesting discovery was that these galaxies were all receding away from us. Their light was redshifted, and the farther you went, the faster they receded. Space was growing. This guitar has not just one, but two layers of wood that both need to be steam bended. The way I like to do this is to secure the center line, and then using a heat gun and water slowly bend the wood into shape. We'll see that process when we get to the ash top. One of the most amazing things about Einstein's theories is the discovery that space-time itself, like this top, bends, stretches, and warps. How is that? How can nothing bend? How can emptiness warp? How can nothing have the qualities and behaviors of a thing? Truth is, science, while able to describe these behaviors in great detail, has a hard time dealing with these questions. We enter the realm of the mystical and the philosophical when we think about them. We tend to think of ourselves as building guitars or making them. But a lot of making guitars is extracting and removing, making space. Space for the arm, space for the leg, a space for the neck, a space for the pickups. Here I am making spaces in order to do some weight relief on this guitar. The wenge and the Purple Heart are extremely heavy at this point. For the record, all the holes you see me drilling here all conform to our ratio of the 12th root of 2. You thought you caught me slipping, right? And even though no one's ever going to see these, I actually tried to find a pleasant geometric shape to follow. And once all that was done, I was ready to glue the top on. So we're going to follow the same order of sequence that we did before. Find the center line, make sure they align perfectly, and then secure the middle. And here you can see the process of using the heat gun and water while slowly clamping down on the ash in order to make it bend and conform. When it's all said and done, you can see how the wood retains the shape of the bend. You can also see the geometric shape here of the sound relief holes. With all the layers and folds finally done, I was ready to begin routing out the cavities of this guitar. Working with a good set of templates really does make all the difference. Michelangelo was quoted as saying that he saw the angel in the marble and simply carved until he set her free. And I was finally ready to set this guitar free. Or as I like to call it, getting her out of her dress. And here it is, an object in space, defined as much by its boundaries than by its physical existence. Nietzsche said, "Beware that, when you gaze long into the abyss gazes also into you." Human beings are naturally repelled by thoughts of emptiness. We associate it with death and darkness. We fear not existing. Nietzsche's warning of nihilism is a fair one. But I don't think the answer is to look away. I think the answer to nihilism is to look even deeper. Once you move past the narcissism of nihilism, past the fear of self-destruction and madness, what you see is the void for what it actually is. The void is the ultimate potential. Nothingness is the soil upon which all creation grows. Every writer must confront the blank page, and every luthier has to confront a block of wood. Confronting the anxiety is the burden of creation. And then only one question remains. What will you bring into being? What will you create? Up to this point, the guitar was coming together really smoothly. For 5 years, I have stared at that metaphorical blank page and imagined this guitar coming into being. In all fairness, the most challenging parts were yet to come, but for now, it's as if it wanted to exist, almost willing itself into being. This is the opposite of most of my builds, by the way, in which I struggle. As anyone who has seen any of my other videos would know. One last little detail that I wanted to include in this build was a layer of purple heart between the fretboard and the wenge of the neck. Hopefully, these two would line up perfectly between the purple heart on the neck and the purple heart on the body. As I was writing this episode as I was building the guitar, I had intended to include a Sufi parable about nothing that I had read ages ago in a book by James Carse. Coincidentally, my brother reached out to me as I was editing this video months later, and he said that he had found a box of old books of mine, some as far as back as high school. By coincidence, the book that contained the parable was in that box. It's called Breakfast at the Victory by James P. Carse, and if you haven't read them, you should. Anyway, as we wrap up in the shop, here's the parable. In one of the great court banquets in the throne room of the king, everyone was seated in order of rank. In came a plain, shabbed man. Unseen, he walked past the banquet to the throne and took a seat. Upon sitting on the throne, he was noticed, and one of the security moved forward, hand on the hilt of his sword. "Identify yourself," he said. "Are you a minister?" "No, I am more," said the man. A minister then stood up and asked, "Are you then the king?" to everyone's amusement. "No, I am more," said the man. So a cleric stood up in his robes and asked, "Are you then God?" "No, I am more than God," said the man. "Blasphemy," responded the cleric. "Nothing is greater than God." "That nothing?" answered the man. "I am."